to Guy surprised many members of the High Court. However, it was particularly difficult to find a match for Sibylla, given that she already had a son, 3-year-old Prince Baldwin, who was next in line for the throne.
So,
Anyone marrying Sibylla had to accept that his own children would be unlikely to inherit the kingdom. But this was no hasty decision on Baldwin's part. The leper king had reliable information that Raymond III of Tripoli and Bohemond III of Antioch were conspiring to seize power in Jerusalem. By this, Raymond and Bohemond planned to wed Sibylla to a husband of their own choice. In addition, Guy's father was a vassal to Henry II, the Angevin king of England. Baldwin himself was descended from the Angevins, and King Henry was fast becoming the most powerful ruler in the West. By selecting a husband for Sibylla from the Angevin camp, Baldwin hoped to increase Henry II's investment in the Crusader kingdom. The popular idea today that Sibylla was a silly girl in love, Guy a blundering newcomer, and Baldwin an ailing king fooled by his manipulative mother does not stand up to historical scrutiny. Baldwin's decision shows careful consideration. His sister Sibylla had been educated to rule, and Guy's brother Amalric had been an effective and useful servant of the crown. Nevertheless, Baldwin would eventually regret his choice for a brother-in-law. Prior to 1180, no serious divisions existed within the kingdom. However, the conspiracy of Raymond and Bohemond, followed by the wedding of Sibylla and Guy, solidified a fault line running through the kingdom's ruling elite.
Actually, been a civil war once already.
His mother, his uncle Jocelyn, Sibylla and Guy, and Raynor of Chatillon, essentially a faction of the king's maternal family. On the other side were Bohemond III, Raymond III, the Ibeline family, and the Dowager Queen Maria Comnena, representing the king's paternal kin. King Baldwin was keenly aware of this division and knew that it threatened the very existence of his kingdom. He was committed to remaining in office until this division could be healed. In the late spring of 1180, King Baldwin sought a 2-year truce with Saladin. Saladin was happy to oblige, for the Seljuk Turks, led by Sultan Kilij Arslan II, were growing in power, and Saladin wanted to check that power. Saladin was also anxious to avoid attracting the intervention of the Byzantine Emperor Manuel. Meanwhile, Baldwin worked to stabilize the situation within his kingdom. To prevent his rivals from advancing his younger sister Isabella as an alternative heir to Sibylla and Guy, the king betrothed Isabella to Humphrey IV of Turon, 15-year-old son of the late constable, in October of 1180. The marriage could not take place until Isabella turned 12, and so the little princess was sent to live at the frontier fortress of Kerak with her future mother-in-law, Stephanie of Milly, wife of Raynor of Chatillon. Here, Isabella would be securely within the power of the king's faction. It was also around this time that the new Grand Master of the Templars reached Jerusalem. He was Arnold of Torroja, a Catalan veteran of the Crusades in Spain. Arnold had been the nominee of Pope Alexander III, who was concerned about the Holy Land and wanted an independent but experienced man in charge of the Templars. Also around this time, the Byzantine Emperor Manuel died. William of Tyre writes,
Manuel, the illustrious emperor of Constantinople, of immortal memory, the most munificent of all the princes of the land, laid aside the burden of the flesh and rendered his soul to heaven. His memory will ever be held in benediction by all the assembly of the saints because of his alms and liberal benefactions.
Baldwin continued to work to strengthen his kingdom. Throughout 1181, he associated Sibylla and Guy with himself in royal edicts, enforcing their status as heirs to the throne. Meanwhile, as the truce with Saladin drew to a close, the High Court sought to heal the divisions between King Baldwin and Count Raymond III. The king agreed to this if Raymond would be reconciled to Guy of Lusignan. The Count gave his assent to these terms, and Guy and Raymond began to take their place together at the meetings of the High Court. The dangerous factionalism seemed healed, while Baldwin, despite his disease, continued to govern the kingdom very effectively. However, Guy of Lusignan remained unpopular with many of the kingdom's high-ranking nobles. The truce with Saladin would end in May 1182. For the past 2 years, Saladin had mostly devoted himself to curbing the Seljuk Turks, as well as building up the strength of his navy, which now contained some 30 to 40 war galleys. In November of 1181, As-Salih, the Zengid prince of Aleppo, fell ill. Before he died in December, he designated as his heir his cousin, Iz ad-Din of Mosul, hoping that the combined powers of Aleppo and Mosul would prevent Saladin from further eroding Zengid territory. Ibn al-Athir records the death of the prince.
When he had given up all hope, he summoned the emirs and all the troops and enjoined them to deliver Aleppo to his cousin, Izz al-Din, and made them swear to that. He said, "You are aware that Saladin has taken the whole of Syria except for what I hold. If Saladin conquers Aleppo, there will be no place left for our family to resist him. But if I give the city to Izz al-Din, he will be able to hold on to it with his large armies and lands."
Hearing that As-Salih was near death, Saladin, who was in Egypt at the time, commanded his nephew Farrukh Shah, the governor of Damascus, to march out with his army and prevent Izz ad-Din from assuming power in Aleppo. However, Reynaud of Chatillon was also watching developments in Aleppo with interest. To frustrate Saladin's plans, Reynaud led a raid from Transjordan into the Arabian desert, pillaging the land and plundering caravans. Farrukh Shah had no choice but to lead his troops against Reynaud, who withdrew before the advancing Damascus army. Ibn al-Athir recorded his impression of these events.
Prince Reynald, Lord of Kirak, one of the most devilish Franks and the most hostile to the Muslims, had prepared for a campaign, gathered his troops and all he could assemble, and determined to march overland to Tariq, and from there to Medina, the city of the Prophet. Allah bless him and give him peace, to gain control of those august regions.
Reynaud's raid prevented Farrukh Shah from carrying out Saladin's orders to occupy Aleppo, allowing Izz ad-Din of Mosul to march into Aleppo and assume his position as ruler without incident. Undeniably, this was a major setback for Saladin, who lost the opportunity to gain his most desired prize in Syria. Reynaud's raids spread terror on the pilgrim road between Mecca and Damascus, and allowed the Lord of Kerak to intercept Saladin's communications from Egypt. Ibn al-Athir was surely wrong that Reynaud intended to conquer these regions. Such a conquest would have been well beyond the resources of the frontier lord, and Reynaud took with him only a small cavalry force. Rather, Reynaud's raid was meant to have a psychological impact. Reynaud wanted to show that Saladin could not protect the pilgrim.
All right. How's everybody doing? I'm going to go in here and switch my audio over so we can get Helena on. All right. So everybody, welcome to Coffee Crusades. We have a special guest with us today. It's Dr. Helena Schrader.
Hi.
Well known
Not that special.
Mhm.
More of a regular.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, regular. But hey, that's even more special. So, all right.
Who did that video you were just showing, J. Stephen?
That's one of mine.
Aha. Okay.
I thought it'd be appropriate since it's related. It kind of falls in line with your book, since it's about the Holy Land and the Crusades in the Holy Land.
That's what this whole thing is about, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, to be fair, I have kind of branched off with my channel,
Okay.
and I do a lot of other topics too nowadays, just because interests have grown. But I'll always have a special place in my heart for the Crusades. I think, no doubt about
All
that.
right, we'll have to discuss that offline. What else you're into now? Okay. We have people asking questions or anything out there?
Yes, indeed. All right, everybody, welcome. So I'm here with Helena Schrader. This is Coffee on the Crusades. So Helena has a book called The Holy Land in the Era of the Crusades, Kingdoms at the Crossroads of Civilizations. I think this will be a good chance to talk to Helena about her book and talk about some of the topics related to the book. We've got some questions coming in, but just briefly, Helena, do you want to kind of give a quick summary of what the book's about and what you were trying to do with it?
Sure. The focus is on the Crusader kingdoms. That's why it's called Kingdoms at the Crossroads of Civilization is the subtitle. Most of what's written and most of what people see out there about this era focus on the Crusades themselves, which, as we all know, were some 8 or more distinct military campaigns from the west to the east. And that tends to be that focus is very focused on, as I say, on the military operations, ignores the fact that, in fact, from 1100 onwards, or actually from 1099, there was a continuous Frankish presence. We use the term Frank, by the way. I'm going to go out. That the Frank is the term that was used contemporaneously to describe Latin Christians, regardless of where they originated. So the Franks, particularly in Outremer, were simply the Latin Christians, whether they were Crusaders or they were people resident in the East. And it's regardless, as I say, of their origins. So it doesn't just mean Franks as in from France or former what we call France. And the point is that for over 200, or very close to 200 years, there was a political presence in the Near East, which was quite unique. It was a very multicultural society. The majority of the population were native Christians, with large Jewish and Muslim minorities, but also with an increasing settler population, because it's estimated, so 140,000 people actually moved to the Crusader kingdoms and settled there. And then, of course, their children also increased the balance of Latins in the Near East. It was a place in which civilizations not only clashed, but also melted together, worked together. It evolved its own art forms, its own lifestyle, its own, even its own political institutions at the very beginning, although it was fundamentally a feudal state. And so this book seeks to focus on that, on the Crusader kingdoms, not on the Crusades. And it's therefore focused less on military events and looks much more at political institutions, economic developments, lifestyle, art, architecture, and all the aspects of stable kingdoms in this era.
Yeah, it's a really good book. It is available on Amazon, so check it out, guys. Those of you who have not picked it up yet. I actually have several copies. I just gave one to a friend, so it's makes a good Christmas gift too, I guess.
That's very true. It does. It's available in hard copy right now, so for particularly as when you're looking at gifts, but it's also an ebook, and it is based on modern scholarship. I mean, what I did is try to pull together a lot of scholarship which exists out there, but is often fragmented, scattered, or in very, very expensive. For example, art history is, for whatever reason, not for whatever reasons, because generally an art history book has to have a lot of prints, which are very expensive to produce. Art history books tend to be very expensive. Books about very narrow subjects like medicine in the period, or about, pottery in the period, or silk trading in the period. These tend to be published as very narrow, as academic, articles in joint books, and then come out with Rutledge or someplace for $150. Most people aren't willing to pay that amount of money to find about a very narrow topic. And so what I tried to do was to take all of those different sources and put together all of those different little articles, which are mosaic pieces describing life in the Crusader states. I tried to bring them together and put that mosaic together in a way that's accessible for the average reader and is affordable to the average reader. Because although this book isn't cheap, it certainly isn't $150.
All right. So any questions kind of directly related to the topic of this book? So the Crusader states, the Crusades in the Holy Land would definitely be, this would be a good time because we've got Helena here to address some of those questions. So in addition to that, let's go ahead and see what people have been asking. Let's see. We've got some hellos from some of the regulars in here. So I'm glad everybody's here. And this is our first question. Marinan, is there really a legend about Charlemagne coming back to fight the Antichrist? What do you think, Helena?
Not my area of expertise. I mean, that's France, the Charlemagne. It makes sense to me. It's sort of like Barbarossa. There's those kind of legends. Arthur. I would say it's very likely that there's that kind of a legend. It was very common in the Middle Ages to think that a great leader would somewhat time come back and defend the country in one form or another. But I honestly don't know.
Yeah, I've never heard of that one either. Although, I mean, Charlemagne would be a candidate for that kind of thing, I would imagine. This is an interesting question from Alexander. Have you heard that Bernard of Clairvaux said that to kill a Muslim was not homicide? And I'm going to go ahead and say straight away, I believe that's a bit of a misreading of what Bernard of Clairvaux said. Would you agree with that, Helena?
Absolutely. Do you have the original quote, or?
I don't have it in front of me, but I mean, just from what I remember, I mean, this is from the stuff about the Templars. This is either the letter to Hugh or from their rule. But I mean, basically what he said was that in the act of holy war, like if a Templar is in battle, then whoever his opponent is in that circumstance, it's not like murder to kill in that circumstance, because it's the circumstance of combat for the sake of the good in the midst of a crusade. So that quote you're actually saying, Alexander, comes from Kingdom of Heaven. That's a comment from one of the characters in Kingdom of Heaven to kind of really, I guess, misrepresent the history of the Crusades, I would say.
Exactly. I would support that entirely. What we do know is that as I say, the Christian theology about just war and the fact that there was a long tradition of being able to fight in the defense of Christianity or in defensive wars of any kind, not just in the defense of Christianity, but also in defense of your home, your family, were justified. Homicide was justicide. So it's to say it's not homicide is not the point. It's saying that there are circumstances, such as the actions of just war, which is defense of the oppressed, and defensive wars, it can be justified. And certainly it was not simply directed, as you say, against Muslims. It was that in situations where you are fighting a just war, you may commit the sin of homicide, but that sin can be forgiven because of the circumstances in which it occurs.
Yeah, and I think it's noteworthy too that St. Bernard says that it would be preferable to achieve the goals of the Crusades without going to war, without engaging in killing, but that if that's impossible, then there may be times when warfare is necessary. And I also think it's kind of noteworthy that the Muslims as a group were really never singled out in Crusades discussions or ideology. I mean, that was one potential opponent of the Crusades, but it was never conceived of as a special war against Muslims. I think some people kind of have that idea.
Not only that, the Crusades were never conceived of as wars of genocide or of wars of conversion. There was no intention of converting Muslims. Is one of the points I make in my book. The Muslims continued to live in the Crusader states. They continued to have their mosques. They could still go on the Hajj. Unlike Christians living in Muslim states, they could build new mosques. They could attend mosques publicly. They could wear the symbols of their religion. All of those things were forbidden to Christians under Islam or under Islamic rule. And there was no attempt to convert, let alone to slaughter Muslims. And another big thing, very similar to this, but it's a little bit off the point, but I think it's important making the point that the Pope never offered a forgiveness of sins for taking part in the crusade. All he said was that there could be transmutation of your penance in another form, but you still had to do penance, and going on crusades did not absolve you of any sins, let alone all.
Absolutely. And this is a good question from Sheila, which really does relate to, this is a topic that's really covered pretty well in The Holy Land in the Era of the Crusades, Helena's book. And it is, Helena mentioned Jews and Muslims living in highly populated Christian areas. Were they able to get along? Did they do any business with one another? In other words, were they able to be civil?
Very. There's substantial evidence to say that most of the people living in the Crusader states, of course, used Arabic, was the lingua franca of the area. Even the Christians in the areas were speaking Arabic by this time, which means that it was very easy to communicate. The societies were not isolated. There was no rigid sense of, I say, apartheid or segregation. Now, there were definitely areas in which the Arabs were more common. The Muslims tended to be, for example, in the area of Nablus and on the borders of Tiberias, they were more numerous, in certain areas, and they tended to live in their own villages, so that the contact between Muslims, Christians, and Jews was more frequent in the urban areas, because rural areas, rural communities living in their own rural, they're not that mobile, and they tended to be living, as I say, either in Christian villages or Muslim villages. The Jews, of course, were more or less an urban population as a rule. And in the urban areas, people integrated completely, and they were sharing the same markets, they were sharing the same, baths, they were sharing any of the public institutions. And there's no indication there's only 2 instances actually of any sort of rebellion on the part of the Muslim population. One of those is very far in the north, at Latakia, close to Latakia, and Antioch, actually, in the Principality of Antioch. And in the very early days before Frankish rule had been consolidated in the south, there was some indication of unrest on the part of the Muslim population. But as we know, Muslim visitors shortly before Hattin complained about the fact that the Muslims were quite happy and seemed to be happier living under their Frankish lords than under their Muslim lords in neighboring areas, because they felt they were getting justice and they had less harsh conditions of labor.
Yeah, and this kind of reminds me of a passage from Usama ibn Munkid, who I think is a Muslim chronicler who you used as a source in your book, Helena. He talks about an instance where the Christians of Shizar, which is the area that was ruled by the Munkidites, were having a festival. It was like some feast day or something, and they had a festival, and he talks about him and his family going out to check it out and and enjoy it. So I think that's kind of indicative of how life in the Holy Land could be at this time, is that you really could have a cross interaction of these cultures. And I mean, essentially what Usama is saying is that his family went out to this Christian festival because it was a to-do that was going on. It was a thing where people were hanging out and enjoying themselves. And so they went out to be a part of it. So I think that's just something we have to keep in mind about this period.
We also have to remember that the hospital employed Muslim and Jewish doctors and caretakers. They had to take an oath on their holy book, whatever one that was. They did not have to take an oath on the Christian Bible. And so these people were integrated in the society in a variety of ways, particularly, as I say, in the markets, because traders were coming in and out, and they were bringing their products, and they would set up a stall, and people would buy from them, and they could communicate using Arabic.
And then let's see, another one from Marinin. So the Crusader Kingdom of Israel is an interesting idea for me. Were the Crusader states just satellite states, puppet kingdoms, or were they their own thing?
Very much their own thing. I mean, this idea that they were colonial powers is absurd, or colonial states, because colonial entities send their monies and their revenues back to the metropolitan area. Now, there were Italian conclaves in the Crusader states, and they were, in fact, part of their metropolitan. So the Venetians, who had like a church and had a market and had some residences all across the Crusader states, in Acre and Tyre, etc. They actually still had the laws of Venice, and they were still citizens of Venice. But the Crusader kingdoms, so the Kingdom of Jerusalem, as it was called, the Kingdom of Cyprus, the County of Tripoli, and the Principality of Antioch, I'm going to come back to Antioch, were independent kingdoms. They were not colonies of the Western king, of any Western kingdom. The Principality of Antioch is a little bit of an exception because ultimately the princes of Antioch do homage to the Holy Roman Emperor because he laid claim to it, and he was more powerful than they were. I'm coming just to the chase and making it simple there. It's not quite that easily, but that's what, fundamentally, that's what happened. But the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Kingdom of Cyprus particularly, were very independent. The Kingdom of Cyprus was, for the first 50 years roughly, nominally part of the Holy Roman Empire, because Amory de Lusignan, to get himself raised from a lord to a king, offered the kingdom to the Holy Roman Emperor, and in exchange he got a crown. But it was it was being part of the Holy Roman Emperor did not mean that you were under any kind of tight control, and certainly didn't mean that you were sending revenues back to the Holy Roman Empire. And the Amory's grandson severed those ties very effectively with the support of the Pope during the reign of Frederick II. But from then on, the Kingdom of Cyprus was totally independent, and it survived more than 100 years beyond the fall of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1291.
All right, then we have one from Ares here. That's the Ares from the Xena Warrior Princess TV series, I believe. So he says, you said the Christians didn't do forced conversions. Did the Muslims do forced conversions for the Christians? What did they do to Christian women and children?
The Sharia law forbids forced conversions. There are clearly instances where prisoners were given a choice of converting or death. So I think, you can talk about it, but as I say, Saladin broke Sharia law regularly, but Christian princes broke Christian law. People in power don't necessarily do what they're supposed to do. They don't necessarily follow the guidelines of their respective religious leadership, or I would say holy, a book or whatever we want to call it. I'm sure they did. However, most women and children, Christian women and children, it was preferable not to convert them because it was easier to keep them enslaved if they were not Muslim. As soon as they were Muslim, they enjoyed a different status. So as a rule, a slave owner, somebody who captured non-Muslim humans, preferred to keep them non-converted because then it enabled greater exploitation.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that there was a wide variety of how this stuff was implemented. I do think there's a fair amount of evidence that Christians and Muslims both, in many circumstances, lived pretty well under the governments of the other religions. It just kind of depends on the time and place. It's a similar situation in Spain too. I mean, incidentally. Let's see here. There's one up here from Lambert. This is I've never heard a question like this before. What was the real opinion of Pulains in Western Europe? Were they looked down on, considered equals?
There was a tendency in Western Europe to blame the Pulains for every failure of the Crusaders. They were easy scapegoats.
Real quick, just in case somebody doesn't know, the Pulains were the Crusaders or the Franks who were born in the Crusader states. So like native-born Latin Christians. Sorry, Helena, go ahead, just in case somebody's confused.
Thank you. As I say, there's considerable complaints about them. You have the Crusaders came out, for example, in the Second Crusade, and they get to the Holy Land, and the Franks say, well, we don't want you to attack Damascus. You came out here because of the loss of Edessa, and the Prince of Antioch is asking you to go against Edessa, but you want to attack Damascus. Well, we actually have a treaty with Damascus at the moment. And I mean, the Crusader states continually had treaties and truces with, I should say truces, because the Muslims didn't recognize, Sharia law forbid having a truce with non-Muslim states. So all you could do was have truces. But they had these truces. They continually had truces. They renewed the truces, which is what I'm saying. They could live actually quite well and peacefully with one another much of the time. But if you come out on a crusade and you get to the Holy Land and you find, oh, they've made a truce with the people I think are the enemy, that tended to discredit the Pulains in the eyes of many Western Europeans, or those fanatics, or those who came out on crusade. It did not mean that they looked down on them socially. The Western princes were perfectly happy to marry the princesses and the ladies of the Crusader kingdoms. They repeatedly sent out high-ranking noblemen who did that, including, as I say, Frederick II, who's the highest-ranking nobleman of Europe in the time, married a princess of Jerusalem. That doesn't mean they're certainly not looking down on them, okay? But there was clear differences of opinion, and there was clear, cultural differences between the Franks of Outremer, who were much less inclined to write negatively about the Muslims, and were much more inclined to look for a way of coexisting than the Crusaders that came from the West.
All right, here's a question from Alexander. Was it illegal for Muslims and Jews to convert in the Kingdom of Jerusalem? And I'm assuming you're talking about them converting to Christianity, Alexander. I mean, maybe clarify that question a little bit. But yeah, maybe clarify that.
We're going to assuming that you're right, Stephen. I know of nothing that says it was illegal. In fact, the Franciscans and the Dominicans who came to the Crusader kingdoms in the 13th century started trying to convert. We know St. Francis himself made that attempt to convert the Sultan in Egypt. So there can't have been a law against it. As I said, it certainly was not
pretty much the opposite, I would say.
But it wasn't. It was clearly not the focus. The Crusades were not wars of conversion, and when they got to the Crusader states, there was not a massive effort to do so. You don't see that for the first 100 years. There is very little. There are converts. Actually, there are converts. There are converts in the entourage of Baldwin I. Coming to think of it, so yeah, there can't have been any law against it. It may not have been the focus, and as I said, it became more important in the 13th century. But certainly, there was no law against it.
And this is an interesting question from Tony. Was there any opposition in the Middle Ages to the concept of holy war?
Absolutely. It was then and now controversial. There are those theologians who reject it entirely. The Byzantine Empire as a whole, the Greek Orthodox Church never really adopted the concept of holy war. As far as I know, Stephen, if you know more than I'm pretty sure of that. I can check it here, but.
Well, I think it's a little bit ambiguous because the Byzantines did have traditions in which there was some sacralization. Maybe that's too strong of a word, of certain aspects of the military. I mean, they liked to have icons on their shields, for example. I mean, there was definitely an idea of invoking God in the field of battle. But yeah, it does seem like they never. This idea of the war itself being kind of a spiritual act and having this spiritual merit, I don't think that ever really became a part of their thinking, as far as I know.
They didn't understand crusading for the first 100 years, which is why they never believed that all these Westerners were really going out to take Jerusalem. They kept saying, oh, they're coming to take Constantinople, because people wouldn't do this. They wouldn't go and fight for Jerusalem. It's too far away. It was never part of their territory. A religious war was so alien to them that they continued to assume that the Crusaders were lying to them and that they had other objectives.
Yeah, and I think a big part of that too is just the very different conception of Christendom. I mean, for the Byzantines, they were Christendom. The empire was this universal empire, whereas the Westerners really thought of themselves as kind of part of this broader thing, these different kingdoms that were all a part of Christendom together, and together they had this obligation. And I think that in itself was kind of baffling to the Byzantines. Is, well, why are they all coming at once type thing,
Well, the Byzantines considered Constantinople the center of the Christian world and Hagia Sophia the holiest church, despite the fact that Saint Helena had, found the tomb, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was built under Constantine the Great, as well as the Church of the Nativity initially. The Byzantines still saw that they saw them as important shrines. It's not, and of course they had priests and monks. I don't want to go to the other extreme, but it didn't have the same central role that it had in Western Christianity, because they had in Constantinople their patriarch and their emperor, which was the head of their church, and therefore they saw Constantinople as at least equal to Jerusalem in holiness.
We're getting so many good questions here. There's a good one from Lambert, which relates directly to your book, Helena. You mentioned that sugar production was effectively pioneered for Europe by Crusader-era Franks. Was this the first large-scale production of sugar? Was it the first large-scale introduction to Europe?
It was certainly the first introduction of as I say, mass-produced sugar in Europe. The question of whether the Arabs had done it before is one of those things scholars fight about. My sources initially said that was true, that the Arabs had only had more or less, house scale, very small production. Yes, it was there was factory production, but it was a very small, what we call it, like household, small cottage industries, as opposed to huge factories as the Franks introduced. I've heard some people question that. I've been challenged, let's say. I've had people write to me and say that's not true. I haven't seen their sources or what they're basing that on. But let's just say at this point, there may be some indication, but certainly not wide scale factory production of sugar.
And lover of truth, how was Richard I's personality? Was he a joyful person, laughing all the time, or very serious and stoic? Should I go for that?
Yeah,
Ellen,
go ahead.
Yeah,
go ahead, Ryle. Then I'll see what you say.
Well, obviously, like you said, Helena, who knows? But he was known as Richard Yes and No. That was one of his nicknames, and the idea behind that was that he was a man of few words. But he seems like somebody who had a very big personality. Like he probably dominated in terms of being imposing. I mean, he was a warlike man. He was an artist. He was a musician. He liked music. We know that. So I don't know. I mean, I think he definitely was not kind of an unhinged hothead the way the Victorians thought. He was somebody who was very thoughtful and who did his homework. I mean, his crusade is a model of somebody doing their homework and getting things in order before they start and maintaining that throughout. So he was a very capable administrator, which I think it's funny we often hear, especially from the Victorian era, that he was a great warrior but a poor administrator, which is absurd.
Yeah, and particularly everything was financially incredibly astute. He was very creative in raising money for the crusade. And that was part of his being cautious. He made sure he had the finances that he could build a fleet. He made sure he had supplies. He made sure he had he had logistical support for his troops. He didn't leave them in the lurch. He didn't just send them out there, and he didn't just live off the land. And he did that because he was very financially astute. And among others, of course, the conquest of Cyprus was brilliant. So he gets this incredible base with a lot of resources, and he gets basically the despot of Cyprus to finance his crusade, because he defeats him and then captures his entire treasure and with that, and not only does he take the treasure from the Cypriot despot, he then sells the island to the Templars. So the Templars have to shove up money to Richard, and when they can't control it, they have to give the money back, and he resells it to Lusignan, who probably didn't have any money. But anyways, clearly the man understood financing and how to keep himself solvent. So this is somebody who was, as you say, very, very good at logistics, very good at tactics and strategy, very good at finances. And but you're saying what was his personality? He was very popular. People who are totally serious and he certainly wasn't stoic. He certainly wasn't an aesthetic kind of person. I mean, he was being constantly criticized by the church because he drank and danced and liked the ladies. And he was certainly not somebody. He was not an aesthetic. He was not a priest-like. He was no Louis the Ninth. This was not a saint-like figure. that all of those things are indicative to me that he probably really could have a good time and laughed when he was feeling like, like any human being, when it was appropriate.
And now that you bring that up, Helena, I remember a passage from Ibn Shaddad where he talks about the fact that Richard had made friends with many of the leading Mamluks in Saladin's entourage, and that there was an episode where they were all together at some sort of meeting, and they were laughing, they were enjoying themselves, telling stories, they were congratulating each other on different achievements in the battlefield, and that just kind of like what you're describing there, that, I mean, this is from, one of our primary sources for Richard's life, coming from the Muslims, which is interesting. So he talks about Richard being somebody who was jovial and could laugh and could kind of, be popular in a group of his enemies, of all things. Like he actually, I mean, he says that he had made friends among some of these Mamluks. I should go back on that. Like, these were Mamluks who I think were attached to Al-Adil's household. So anyway,
it still holds that this was somebody that, and again, we have to go back and look at it at other sources, but I didn't look for that specifically, but based on everything I've read, I certainly didn't come away with the feeling that he was a serious, much less, as I say, aesthetic kind of person.
So a couple nice comments here about the book. Sheila Horn, I've got to get this book.
Please.
We agree. Yeah, and just to remind everybody, we're talking about Holy Land in the era of the Crusades, a really good book about the Crusader states that Helena has written. I hope you guys will check it out on Amazon and pick up a copy or two for the Christmas season. Lambert says it's a great book. I know Lambert may have been one of the first ones to pick it up when we first started talking about it.
It's a great Christmas present, Jake.
Yeah, I just sent it to a friend of mine who likes the Crusades. I ended up getting like 3 copies or something, Helena, because you sent me one, your publisher sent me one. I think maybe your sister or somebody sent me one. I've got my own copy, and then I had 2 to give to people. So that's pretty cool.
But another thing I just mentioned while we're doing the promotion here, it includes a very, very extensive chronology. I worked very hard on that. I pulled together chronologies from like 4 or 5 different sources, and I tried to then drop in little bits of things that people are more familiar, like the Battle of Hastings, or the Simon de Montfort's rebellion and things like that. Particularly for the English reader, it's an English publisher, because it helps people keep it in context of what was going on elsewhere, and that alone is it's an excellent reference. I mean, if you're looking at this period, that you can have that at your fingertips. I also have good, excellent maps, which even Adrian Boas praised, of the Crusader states and how they expanded and retracted, and also some genealogy tables of both the Lusignans, the Ibelins, and the House of Jerusalem. So those are useful tools as references. If you're someone who's interested in doing more research on the Crusades, it's sort of a good base book to have as a reference.
Yeah, the maps are great, and I do think it is noteworthy that you got that endorsement from Adrian Boas, who is, I would say, probably the leading Crusades archaeologist in Israel right now. So
he was the founder of the Department of Crusades Archaeology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I don't think you can get any better than that.
Yeah. Speaking of which, I need to try to get him to join us sometime on this. He did do a live stream with Helen and I once, which was really interesting, and you can still check it out on the page. But yeah, he's a good guy. We like Adrian. Okay, Anna Komnena is here with us. We have all these famous historical figures who are asking questions today. We'll do a couple more questions, guys, before we wrap up. Anna Komnena, princess of the Byzantine Empire, says, what was the opinion of the Latins on the Komnenos emperors, Alexios, John, and Manuel? Was Richard I justified in taking Cyprus from the Komnenos house?
I will add to that. First of all, the opinion changed. It varied. Let's put it this way. Manuel basically became a close ally of the Crusader states. They worked closely together. There was obviously with Alexius, they felt they had betrayed them. And Manuel then overcame that hostility, and they worked very closely together through the 60s. But at his death, that all fell apart, particularly because the successor, the Angelos, made a treaty with Saladin and actively tried to stop the Third Crusade. But during the reign of Manuel I, actually the Crusader states and the Byzantine Empire were closely allied. There were multiple marriages. Manuel married, of course, the Princess of Antioch. Almaric the First, before Almaric, it's Baldwin III marries Theodora, a princess of the Comnena house, and Almaric marries another princess of the house of Comnena. Richard III did not take the Cyprus away from
Richard
a member
of,
obviously. Right, sorry. Richard I.
Good old Richard III.
Yeah. We can do something. We can do something. Another controversial figure. No, Richard I took Cyprus from a renegade of the House of Comnenus. Isaac was considered a despot by the Cypriots, by the Byzantines on the island. We have records from it's not Hilarion, Neophytus, condemning what Isaac has done in vehement terms. Isaac was not considered a legitimate member and legitimate ruler of Cyprus by the time Richard arrived, and Richard immediately received the support of local elites because they hated Isaac Comnenus so much.
Right.
Richard was brilliant also in his tactics because he promised to restore the laws of Manuel I. So he told the Cypriots in his negotiations that he would take away what they considered extortionist and cruel and vile. I mean, Isaac was accused of everything you could imagine. Those always make me skeptical, because if everybody is accused of sort of like, what you accuse the Templars of or whatever, but he was clearly hated. You don't conquer an island as powerful and as large as Cyprus in 2 weeks with the loss of only 2 men, 6 weeks if you tell the entire island with the loss of 2 men, if the locals are defending their own ruler. Isaac was defending the island with mercenaries, with Armenian mercenaries, and he did not have the support of the local population, who came in very strongly on the side of Richard. All of those things say, yes, he was justified.
Absolutely. And I wanted to point out that Manuel Comnenus had a general in his service who was one of his highest ranking men, named Baldwin of Antioch, who was a Frankish knight. And he was one of the main commanders at this battle in 1176. I actually don't know how to pronounce the name from this battle, Helena. Maybe you can. Okay. I'm sure you know about this one, the Battle of. It's one of those. What is it?
Maybe.
How do you say it?
Myriokephalon.
Okay, that sounds right.
Yes.
But yeah, that's a famous battle that Manuel was involved with in 1176, and it was a defeat for him. But I was reading, I can't remember which book I was reading, but the author was talking about how the only general who showed any courage there was this Baldwin of Antioch, and that if his other commanders had been equal to Baldwin, then they probably could have won the battle. So kind of interesting there about that close association.
We're back to Alexios asking for support because he thought the Normans and the Western Knights were good fighters. I mean, the Byzantines respected the fighting capacity of the Franks. They just didn't think they were very civilized.
Yeah, and I think Manuel, of all the emperors, he's the one who seems to give evidence of the closest association with the Franks. I mean, obviously he married a Frankish woman. He had a lot of Franks at his courts. He was kind of a Francophile type of emperor, and that made him some enemies in Constantinople, right, as we would find out after his death.
Yeah.
All right. So how about we do?
He wasn't initially. When you look at that, Manuel was initially quite anti-Frank. It was after Renaud de Chatillon attacked Cyprus, and that if you're asking for who was unjustified in attacking Cyprus, it was Renaud de Chatillon's attack on Cyprus, which was total piracy. And Manuel then went against, led his armies against Antioch. And Baldwin III supports him and says, I'm not going to help Manuel. I'm not going to help Reyno. He is in violation of our church too. You know, he's on his own. And that made Manuel think, oh, maybe this Baldwin III character is not such a bad person to get in touch with. And that's where they started then communicating and came up with an alliance. Because he realized that Baldwin III was not going to just give Chatillon a blank check and was perfectly willing to let Chatillon pay the price for his own violence.
And Julia says, bought the book and I'm loving it. So that's good news.
Thank you.
Sheila says, looking forward to purchasing Helena's book for myself. It will be a Christmas gift for myself. Okay, that's good.
That's one way of doing it.
All right. So I'm going to look for 2 more questions from people who haven't asked anything yet. Here's a nice comment from Lucas. Want to say I always enjoy your live broadcasts, especially with Dr. Helena. Thank you. Well, thank you, Lucas. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Chris, I don't think Chris has asked a question yet. He says, question for Helena. Do you think the first crusade should have captured Damascus and Aleppo?
Honest answer, no, of course not. It would have been absurd. They barely made it to Jerusalem. They're lucky to have got Jerusalem. They were reduced to 20% of their strength. Going for Damascus and Aleppo, which had no Christian ties whatsoever. I mean, why on earth would they do that? I mean, the bigger question is why Almaric tried to get Cairo. I mean, that's where the Crusader states really go off, because they lose that sense of defending the Holy Land and start acting like just a regional power seeking to expand their geography and their financial resources. But certainly during the First Crusade, there would have been no possibility and no justification for taking purely Arab cities.
And now let's look for somebody else who hasn't asked a question yet. I thought I saw one. Yeah, here's Dan. He has not asked one yet. He says, can you recommend a book of historical fiction which is broadly historically accurate?
It was just a flat, Casey. Dan,
from two historical fiction authors.
Exactly. I think I've written a trilogy on Balaam the Evil, and actually it's 4 books about and I came to writing the Holy Land in the era of the Crusades because I'd done so much research for the novels that I realized, as I said, that I had to that it made sense to pull it all together because there was no one book out there that did that. But everything that's in the Holy Land was stuff I learned while I was writing novels, and I really did my best to make the novels accurate and authentic. And there's 3 on Balaam the Evil, which starts with Knight of Jerusalem, or Balaam the Evil and Knight of Jerusalem, then the Defender of Jerusalem, and then the Envoy of Jerusalem. And the Last Crusader Kingdom talks about the establishment of the Frankish Kingdom of Cyprus. And then I go into the 13th century and I look at the civil war between the Emperor Frederick II and the barons of Outremer, led by John the Evil and Balian's son. And there are 2 books in that series, which is Rebels Against Tyranny and The Emperor Strikes Back. And they're all available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Book Depository, and they're both in paperback and in ebooks.
All right. So I think with that, guys, we'll kind of start wrapping up.
Well, Jay Stevens, you get to do a plug for your book.
Oh, yeah. I have a book called Why Does the Heathen Rage, which is a historical fiction on the Crusades. So that's out there, too, if you guys want to check that out. I am going to get one out about the Third Crusade before too long, hopefully. It's pretty much done. I just need to go over it maybe 1 or 2 more times just to kind of polish it up. I need to send it to you again, actually, Helena.
Thank you. And the Envoy of Jerusalem is the one that describes the Third Crusade, but through the eyes of the people living in Outremer, in other words, from the point of view of the Ebelins. And Defender of Jerusalem describes the Battle of Hattin and the Siege of Jerusalem. Well, actually, the whole 10 years leading up to the Battle of Hattin.
Yeah, and those are a great set of books, by the way, guys. So, okay, couple of final comments here. Princess Anna says this is the best channel about the Crusades on YouTube. Well, thank you, Princess Anna.
Thank you, yes.
Lambert says, thank you so much, Helena. Come back soon. So,
okay,
good deal.
Hope so. Okay.
All right, guys, we appreciate it. Helena, so good to have you. Appreciate you coming by.
Always happy to be here. Well, we can talk about scheduling the next one.
Absolutely. And so we'll talk to you guys again. I'll be back on Tuesday, same time, noon Eastern time, 11 a.m. Central time for Coffee and the Crusades. I will see everybody then.